Somewhere, right now, a hunter is kneeling in the rain. The gas lamps of Yharnam are hissing quietly against the wet stone, and the fog is rolling low across the cobblestones like it's breathing. Somewhere above the rooftops, a bell is tolling, slow and heavy, calling something that no one wants to name. And in a small, dim workshop tucked away from the chaos of the hunt, a doll made of porcelain and old thread sits in a chair by the window, waiting for someone who may never come home. You don't need to remember any of that right now. You don't need to remember the bosses or the blood vials or the exact order of the chalice dungeons. You don't need to remember anything at all. Tonight, all you need to do is lie back, get comfortable, and let your mind drift into the fog with me. Because tonight, we're going to talk about endings. Not the kind that snap you awake with fireworks and triumphant music. The quiet kind. The kind that ask a question and then let the silence answer for you. Bloodborne, if you've never played it, or if you played it so long ago that it's faded into a soft grey memory, is a game about a nameless hunter who arrives in the city of Yharnam seeking a cure for an unnamed illness. What they find instead is a city consumed by a nightmare, a hunt that never truly ends, and a dream that they cannot wake from. And at the very end of that dream, after all the blood and the beasts and the impossible geometry of cosmic horror, there are 3 ways the story can close. 3 doors, 3 different kinds of quiet. Tonight we're going to open each of those doors, slowly, gently, and look inside. We're going to talk about Gehrman, the old man in the wheelchair who's been waiting so long for someone to end things properly. We're going to talk about the moon presence, watching from somewhere just beyond the edge of what your eyes can hold. We're going to talk about the doll and the secret folded up quietly inside her chest. And we're going to talk about a baby, held gently in small pale arms at the very end of everything. You don't have to hold on to any of it. That's the beauty of a story like this one. It's already finished. It already happened. All you have to do is listen and let the weight of it settle over you like a blanket, heavier and heavier, until your eyes just close. So get comfortable, turn the lights down if you haven't already, and let's step into the dream together one last time. Let's begin at the beginning, because that's usually the kindest place to start. Chapter 1. Welcome back to Yharnam. Picture it with me. Cobblestone streets slick with rain that never seems to actually fall, just exist, hanging in the air like a memory of weather. Yharnam is a city built into hills, its buildings stacked on top of each other like something growing rather than something built. All spires and gutters and narrow alleys that fold back on themselves. It's a Gothic city, heavy with old stone and older secrets, lit by gas lamps that throw long trembling shadows across walls stained dark with things you'd rather not look at too closely. The hunter, you if you played it, or the character you're picturing right now if you didn't, arrives in Yharnam because of an illness. It's never given a specific name in the game itself, but the community calls it the Ashen Blood Curse, or simply the Bloodborne Plague, a disease that Yharnam's clinic claims to be able to cure through blood ministration, a treatment that involves being infused with blood, harvested from an ancient and unknowable source. It sounds strange because it is strange, and that strangeness is really the whole point. From the very first cutscene, you're told almost nothing, and what little you were told turns out to be only a thin skin stretched over something much larger and much older underneath. You wake up in a clinic, a small mysterious figure murmuring something about a hunter's contract, and just like that, you're a hunter now, thrown into a city in the grip of what's called the Hunt. Every night the people of Yharnam succumb to a kind of madness called beasthood, transforming into terrible creatures, and hunters like you are tasked with putting them down before the sun rises. Except the sun, in this story, is complicated too. Time doesn't behave the way you expect. Nights stretch on far longer than they should, and slowly, painfully, you start to realise that Yharnam isn't just a city with a monster problem. It's a city built on top of something ancient, something that has been quietly reshaping the people who live there for a very long time. This is where the game's central mythology starts to unfold, slowly, like ink spreading through water. Long before the events of the game, a civilization called the Pthumerians lived beneath Yharnam, worshipping and communing with beings called the Great Ones. These Great Ones are not gods in the traditional sense. They're something closer to cosmic entities, vast and incomprehensible, existing partially outside of normal human perception. The Pthumerians, and later the people of Yharnam, through an organisation called the Healing Church, sought communion with these Great Ones, believing that contact with them could grant transcendence, knowledge, even a kind of evolution beyond the limits of ordinary human minds. The Healing Church, led by a scholar named Lawrence, discovered the blood of an old one, later revealed to be a great one named Ebrietas, deep beneath the city, in a hidden chalice dungeon called the Fishing Hamlet, a place we'll return to a little later tonight. This blood became the foundation for the church's medical practices. Blood ministration wasn't just medicine, it was communion. Every transfusion was a kind of quiet, unknowing prayer, and over time the people of Yharnam became soaked in Great One blood without ever fully realising what it meant. Some grew stronger, sharper, touched by insight beyond normal human comprehension. Others grew into beasts, their bodies and minds warped by contact with something too big for them to hold. This is the atmosphere you're steeped in as you play, or as I describe it to you now. A city slowly, quietly consumed from the inside, not by an invading army but by its own desperate hunger for knowledge and healing. Everyone in Yharnam wanted something, a cure, enlightenment, contact with something greater than themselves. And in reaching for it, they built a cage they didn't know they were building and stepped inside it willingly. As the hunter, you move through this cage. You fight through the crowded, blood-soaked streets of central Yharnam, climb the twisting cathedral spires of Cathedral Ward, wade through the swamps of the Forbidden Woods, and eventually descend into the ancient buried ruins beneath the city where the Pthumerians once lived, and where the very first Great One contact occurred. Each area peels back another layer of the mystery, and each layer makes the picture a little larger, a little stranger, and honestly, a little sadder, because underneath all the cosmic horror, Bloodborne is fundamentally a tragedy. It's the story of people who wanted to be better, who wanted to heal the sick and understand the universe, and who paid for that desire with their sanity, their humanity, and in many cases their lives. By the time you reach the end of the main story, you fought werewolf-like beasts in the streets, colossal cosmic horrors in flooded churches, and even other hunters driven mad by the very hunt they were sworn to perform. You've met Eileen the Crow, a hunter who hunts other hunters gone bad. You've met the enigmatic Alfred, a vile bloods hunter obsessed with purging a corrupted bloodline. You've wandered chalice dungeons that seem to exist outside of normal space, built by the Pthumerians to reach even deeper into the earth towards something called the Great One's original home. Let your mind drift over that journey slowly, the way you might flip through an old photo album. The central Yharnam streets, narrow and crowded, torches burning in windows above you while shambling, hunched figures with pitchforks and torches of their own stumble through the fog below. The Cathedral Ward, all soaring stone arches and stained glass windows that seem to watch you as you pass beneath them, home to some of the Healing Church's most devoted, most tragically twisted followers. The Forbidden Woods, thick with poison mist and twisted trees, home to the shunned village and its strange animalistic bloodletting beast, itself a haunting echo of the very themes we've spent tonight walking through. A Great One's blood taken and used, transforming something ordinary into something no longer quite recognisable. Then there's old Yharnam, a district set ablaze generations before the main story even begins, an entire neighbourhood sacrificed and burned in a desperate, brutal attempt to contain an earlier beast outbreak. Its charred rooftops and ash-choked streets carry a very particular kind of dread, the dread of a decision that was made once already by other hunters in another time, and that clearly didn't solve the underlying problem so much as simply delay it. Jura, a hunter stationed there, refuses to keep killing the transformed townsfolk he once knew personally, and his quiet, weary refusal is its own small echo of the larger themes running through the whole story. How do you keep fighting a hunt that never actually seems to end, against people, or former people, you once cared about? And beneath all of it, literally beneath the city itself, lie the Pthumerian ruins, Yahargul, the unseen village, home to Mikolash and his order of scholars pursuing forbidden knowledge with a hunger that eventually consumes them entirely, and further down still, ancient silent chambers where the very first communion between humanity and the Great Ones took place, long before Yharnam existed as a city at all. Walking through these lower depths feels less like exploring a dungeon, and more like descending through layers of buried history, each one older and stranger than the last, until you finally reach something close to the origin point of everything that's gone wrong above. Off to one side of the main path entirely sits Cainhurst Castle, reachable only through a frozen snow-choked lake that feels almost like stepping into a different story altogether. Cainhurst was once home to a noble bloodline called the Vile Bloods, a family whose queen, Annalise, supposedly discovered her own separate means of communing with something ancient, cultivating a bloodline said to grant strange, cold vitality to anyone who drank of it. The Healing Church, viewing this rival practice as heretical, eventually purged the castle in a massacre, leaving its halls frozen, silent, and populated by the ghosts of knights who never stopped defending a queen with almost nobody left to rule. Ariana, a woman you can meet earlier in Yharnam streets, ties quietly into this location too, her own storyline offering a small, aching coda to the whole tragic history of Cainhurst, depending on the choices you make regarding her. And through all of it there is the hunter's dream, a strange pocket dimension where you return between hunts, tended by a doll who never quite blinks, and a wheelchair-bound old man named Gehrman who never quite seems to be looking at anything in the room with you. We'll get to both of them very soon, but for now, just picture the rain. Picture the gas lamps. Picture the fog rolling low over cobblestones slick with something that might be rainwater and might not be. That's Yharnam. That's the world we're going to slowly close the door on tonight, one ending at a time. Take a breath. Let your shoulders drop a little. We're just getting started and there's no rush at all. Chapter 2. The Hunter's Dream. Before we can really talk about the endings, we need to talk about the place where all three of them actually happen, because in Bloodborne, the ending isn't decided out in the bloody streets of Yharnam. It's decided in a small, quiet garden, tucked somewhere outside of normal space and time called the Hunter's Dream. The Hunter's Dream is where you return every time you die, or every time you use one of the game's teleportation stones. It looks, on the surface, almost peaceful. A stone workshop, ivy creeping up the walls, a single tombstone glowing faintly at its centre that you use to travel between hunting grounds. There's a small graveyard nearby, rows of stone markers standing quietly in the grass, and a wheelchair by a workbench, occupied by an old, tired-looking man who almost never lifts his head. There's a doll too, standing perfectly still near the entrance until you approach her, and then she moves with a gentle, careful stiffness, speaking in a soft, measured voice that never quite rises or falls. The dream feels safe. That's the trick of it. After the chaos of Yharnam's nightmare streets, the dream is quiet, still, almost gentle. But like most things in this story, that gentleness is hiding something much stranger underneath. The hunter's dream, we come to learn, is not simply a rest stop. It's a hunting ground of its own, a dream constructed and maintained by a great one for a very specific purpose. Every hunter who's ever taken up the hunt in Yharnam has passed through this same dream, tethered to it by a contract, bound to it until either the hunt is finished or until they're released by another means entirely. And that word, released, is really the heart of everything that's about to happen. The man in the wheelchair is Gehrman, and he was the very first hunter. Long before you or any of the other hunters we meet throughout the story, Gehrman hunted beasts in Yharnam using his own skill, his own workshop tools, and eventually with the aid of a mysterious being that offered him something extraordinary, an escape from an unbearable reality. Gehrman, we learn through fragments of dialogue and item descriptions scattered throughout the game, was gravely injured in the years before the main story begins. Confined to a wheelchair, his body broken, his hunting days seemingly behind him, he was approached by a great one, the Moon Presence, who offered him a new existence, a dream where he could rest and where he could train new hunters to continue his work. Gehrman accepted, and so the hunter's dream was born. A space suspended outside of time, where Gehrman could exist without the burden of his shattered body, where new hunters would be drawn in one after another, trained and sent out into Yharnam's nightmare, cycling endlessly through the hunt. Each night in Yharnam, in this reading of events, is not simply one continuous timeline, it's a loop, a cycle that resets hunter after hunter, dream after dream, with Gehrman as its unwilling caretaker and the Moon Presence quietly, patiently watching from somewhere just beyond the veil. This is important because it reframes everything you thought you understood about the game up to this point. You're not simply a hunter passing through Yharnam once. You may be the latest in an endless looping procession of hunters, each one drawn into the same dream, each one facing the same nightmare, some succeeding, most failing, all of them eventually replaced by the next unlucky soul to answer the same call. And Gehrman, trapped at the centre of it all, is exhausted, genuinely, deeply exhausted, in a way that becomes more and more apparent the longer you spend in his company. He speaks to you gently at first, offering advice, warning you about the terrors that await beyond the workshop doors. But as the game progresses, his tone shifts. He starts talking about endings, about being tired, about wanting more than anything for someone, for you, to finally, mercifully, bring the dream to a close. The doll, meanwhile, exists as a kind of quiet constant throughout your time in the dream. She tends to you, allows you to level up your character by giving your echoes to her, offers small fragments of comfort in a voice that never quite feels fully human, though it's warm in its own careful way. For most of the game, she seems to be exactly what she appears, a caretaker, a comfort, a familiar presence in an unfamiliar place. But, and we'll come back to this properly in a later chapter, the doll is not simply a doll. She's something else entirely, something with a much deeper connection to the story's cosmic horror than her calm, gentle demeanour would ever suggest. There's a small, sad detail worth mentioning here too. The graveyard within the hunter's dream. Rows of tombstones stand quietly in the grass near the workshop, and if you interact with certain ones, you find messages, brief and understated, referencing hunters who came before you. Some of these graves can be visited to relive brief memories or receive small gifts, quiet echoes of lives that once passed through this exact same dream, doing exactly what you're doing now before their own story concluded, one way or another. It's easy to walk right past this graveyard without much thought during a normal playthrough, focused as you usually are on levelling up and heading back out to the hunt. But if you slow down the way we're slowing down together right now, it becomes one of the most quietly devastating parts of the entire game. Physical proof laid out in neat little rows of just how many hunters came before you, and just how few of them, presumably, ever made it all the way through to any kind of ending at all. The workshop itself, too, deserves a slower look. Weapons hang along the walls, a headstone glows at the centre of the room, used to travel to different hunting grounds throughout Yharnam, and messengers, small hooded figures with wide, quiet eyes, shuffle about performing small tasks, occasionally offering strange little rhymes or bits of dialogue if you interact with them. Everything about the space feels handmade, personal, cared for, in stark contrast to the crumbling, blood-soaked streets you spend most of your time fighting through out in the waking world. It's meant to feel like a refuge, and for most of the game it does. It's only slowly, gradually, that you start to realise just how strange and just how quietly sad this particular refuge actually is. So here is the shape of the dream, held loosely in your mind, a quiet garden, suspended outside of time, maintained by a cosmic being for reasons that are only slowly revealed. An old broken man trapped at its centre, desperate for release. A doll standing watch, more than she seems, and you, the hunter, moving back and forth between this quiet, dreamlike sanctuary and the blood-soaked nightmare of Yharnam streets, slowly uncovering the truth of what this place actually is and what it will eventually ask of you. Because eventually, near the very end of the game, once you've defeated enough of Yharnam's nightmares and gathered enough of the story's scattered truths, Gehrman will ask you a question. He'll offer you a choice. And that choice, how you answer him and what happens in the moments immediately after, determines which of the three endings you receive. We're going to walk through each of those three endings now, slowly, one at a time, the way you might walk through three doors in a long, quiet hallway. There's no need to rush toward any of them. Let's just take them one by one, gently, and see what waits behind each one. Settle in a little further. We're getting to the good part now. Chapter 3, Ending 1. Yharnam Pthumerian Queen. The first ending we're going to talk about tonight is often considered by longtime players to be the bad ending, though I want to gently push back on that word a little, because I don't think anything in Bloodborne is quite so simple as good or bad. This ending is called Yharnam Pthumerian Queen, and it happens if you refuse Gehrman's offer near the end of the game, or if certain conditions aren't met that would trigger one of the other two endings. Let's set the scene properly. You fought your way through nearly all of Yharnam's nightmare. You faced down Vicar Amelia, Rom the vacuous spider, Mikolash, the host of the nightmare, and Murgo's wet nurse, a horrifying, veiled figure who guards the location of something called Murgo, an infant great one whose crying can be heard faintly echoing through certain corners of the world if you listen closely enough. After defeating the wet nurse, you're pulled back into the hunter's dream one final time, and it's here that Gehrman finally speaks to you plainly. He tells you that the hunt is over, that you've done what needed to be done, and then, quietly, almost gently, he asks you to end things. He offers to grant you your wish, freedom from the hunt, and escape from the endless cycle of dreams and nightmares, but only if you allow him to end your life, right there, in the dream. It's framed almost like a mercy. Gehrman, tired beyond words, is offering you a way out that he himself never received. A clean, final death, rather than an eternity trapped in service to the dream. If you refuse this offer, if you choose to fight back against Gehrman instead of accepting his blade, you enter into direct combat with him. This fight itself is quiet and sad in a way that a lot of Bloodborne's boss fights aren't. Gehrman isn't some towering cosmic horror. He's an old man fighting with the same weapons and techniques you've been using all game, moving with a kind of practiced, weary precision that makes the whole encounter feel less like a climactic final boss and more like watching someone finally, reluctantly, do something they've dreaded doing for a very, very long time. If you manage to defeat Gehrman in this fight, the moon presence descends. This is your first real, direct glimpse of the entity that's been quietly steering events from behind the scenes for the entire game. A massive, pale, jellyfish-like great one that had been possessing and guiding Gehrman throughout his long service to the dream. With Gehrman defeated, the moon presence simply claims you instead. It bonds with you the same way it bonded with him, making you the new caretaker of the hunter's dream, the next hunter fated to remain trapped in this quiet, looping purgatory, training the next unlucky soul who arrives seeking a cure for their illness. In this ending, the final cutscene shows your hunter, cloaked in a strange new shadow, echoing Gehrman's transformation from earlier in the story, growing what look like horns or perhaps antennae, sprouting from your head, a physical marker of communion with the Great One. You're shown seated in the same chair Gehrman once occupied, in the same workshop, in the same dream, and the narrator, if you're playing the game with narration on, or if this were being read to you the way it's being read to you now, would tell you something like this. And so the hunter's dream comes to an end, but another illusion takes hold and binds a new dreamer to that dark dream, deep in slumber, as vermin gather, to become prey for hunters not of a sane mind. From this day, the good hunter shall become the hunter's prey, an unenlightened soul, trapped within a dream, from which there is no awakening, until a stronger hunter one day comes along. It's a beautiful, quiet, mournful piece of writing, and it tells you exactly what you need to know. This ending doesn't end the cycle, it continues it. You take Gehrman's place as caretaker of the dream, tasked with training the next hunter who arrives, waiting patiently for that next hunter to one day fight and defeat you, just as you fought and defeated Gehrman, so that the cycle can begin again, endlessly, forever, or at least until someone finds a way to actually break it. This is why some players call it the bad ending. It's the only one of the three that ends with the cycle continuing rather than resolving. But I think there's something worth sitting with here, something worth turning over gently in your mind before you drift off. This ending isn't a punishment exactly, it's a consequence. It's what happens when you fight against fate, instead of accepting the mercy that's being offered to you, and in doing so you become the very thing you were fighting against in the first place. There's a kind of somber poetry in that, a warning even, about the danger of refusing to let go, about how resistance to an ending can sometimes just create a new version of the exact same trap. Now, and I do want to pause here for just a second before we continue deeper into the dream together. If you've been enjoying this slow walk through Yharnam's fog so far, and if you'd like more long, calm lore explanations like this one to drift off to, consider leaving a like on this video or subscribing for future uploads. It genuinely helps this little channel keep going, and it costs you nothing but a small tap before you close your eyes. There's no rush to do it right now. You can even do it tomorrow, or the next time one of these videos catches your attention. I just wanted to gently mention it here in the middle of the fog, the way an old hunter might quietly point out a shortcut on the road before we keep walking. Alright, let's keep going. Let your eyes rest a little heavier now, if they haven't already started to. We've got 2 more endings to walk through together, and they get gentler from here, I promise. The Pthumerian Queen title itself, by the way, comes from an item you can find in the game called the Yharnam Stone, or from certain messages and lore descriptions that reference Yharnam Pthumerian Queen, tying this ending thematically to the ancient civilization that once ruled beneath the city, and to Yharnam herself, a figure implied to have once been a great queen of the Pthumerians, whose blood and legacy still echo through the city that bears her name. It's a small detail, easy to miss, but it reinforces the idea that this ending is fundamentally about continuation rather than conclusion. The old blood, the old cycle, the old dream, persisting quietly underneath everything, waiting for its next unwilling participant. There's something almost hypnotic about that idea, isn't there? A dream that never quite ends. A hunt that always finds its next hunter. Picture it slowly. Somewhere out there, right now, in some other imagined version of this story, a different hunter is climbing the same stairs you once climbed, passing through the same fog-choked streets, arriving at the same quiet workshop, and finding you there instead of Gehrman, waiting patiently in the chair, ready to offer the same tired warnings, the same careful guidance, the same weary hope that this new arrival might finally be the one to end things properly. It's a strange thing to imagine yourself into, this looping continuation, but there's a kind of stillness in it too, once the initial melancholy settles. Nothing truly ends, it only changes hands gently from one tired caretaker to the next, forever. I want you to hold that thought gently as we move into the next chapter, because the second ending offers something very different. An actual honest release. Let's go find it together. Chapter 4, Ending 2. Honouring Wishes. If the first ending was about resistance and about becoming trapped by the very thing you were fighting against, then the second ending is about the opposite. It's about surrender, in the gentlest, most compassionate sense of that word. This ending is commonly called Honouring Wishes, and it's considered by most of the community to be the standard or neutral ending. Not bad, not secret, just the natural, honest conclusion to the story if you're paying attention to what's actually being asked of you. The setup is the same as before. You've defeated Murgo's wet nurse. You've returned to the hunter's dream one final time. Gehrman is waiting for you, tired, quiet, sitting in his wheelchair near the workshop, and he offers you the same choice he offered before, an ending to the hunt, a release from the dream, granted through his hand, through his blade, quietly and mercifully. This time, instead of fighting back, you accept. If you simply do nothing when Gehrman moves toward you, if you don't dodge, don't attack, don't resist in any way, he ends your character's life, right there in the dream. The scene that follows is quiet in a way that very few video game endings manage to be. There's no boss fight, no dramatic music swell, just an old man doing something he's clearly been dreading, granting a mercy that costs him something enormous every single time he grants it. The cutscene that follows shows your hunter's eyes finally closing, the dream dissolving around you, and then, this is the part that tends to stick with people. You wake up. Not in the dream, not in Yharnam. You wake up in the exact same clinic bed where the game began. At the very start of the story, machinery clicking somewhere nearby. The room dim and quiet. Sunlight, or what might be sunlight, filtering weakly through a window. It's an incredibly ambiguous, incredibly quiet moment, and it can be read a few different ways, which is honestly part of why it resonates with so many players. One reading is that this is simply death, framed gently. The hunter dies in the dream, and this final shot of waking in the clinic bed represents the true, mortal death of their physical body back in the real world, released at last from both the hunt and the illness that brought them to Yharnam in the first place. In this reading, the title Honouring Wishes refers to the hunter's presumed original wish, to be cured of their illness, being granted in the only way it realistically could be, through death and the release that comes with it. Another reading, a little more hopeful, suggests that this ending represents genuine awakening, that the hunter has broken free of the dream cycle entirely, waking up back in ordinary reality, their nightmare finally over, free to live out whatever remains of their life outside of Yharnam's grip. Under this reading, honouring wishes refers not just to Gehrman honouring the hunter's unspoken wish for release, but to the hunter finally honouring their own original goal, walking away from Yharnam, cured or not, alive, free, done with hunting forever. Either way, the emotional core of the ending is the same: mercy, freely given and freely accepted, breaking the cycle that continues eternally in the first ending we talked about. Gehrman, freed from his own endless servitude to the dream by finally passing his burden along in an act of compassion rather than combat, is shown in some interpretations to finally find his own peace as well, his long, exhausted service finally, mercifully, complete. I think what makes this ending so quietly powerful is how understated it is. There's no cosmic reveal here, no shocking twist, no grand final battle against some impossible horror. It's just an old man doing a hard, kind thing for someone he's grown to care about over the long, strange nights of training and guidance. And it's you, the hunter, finally allowing yourself to stop fighting, to stop hunting, to simply rest. There's something worth sitting with in that idea before we move on tonight. So much of Bloodborne, and honestly so much of the broader genre of games it belongs to, is built around resistance. Fighting harder, getting stronger, refusing to give up no matter how many times you fall. And here, right at the very end, the game quietly offers you the opposite lesson. Sometimes the bravest, kindest thing you can do is simply let go. Sometimes the ending you're looking for isn't found by fighting harder. It's found by finally, gently, allowing yourself to stop. Gehrman's own dialogue in the moments leading up to this ending reinforces this beautifully. He talks about wanting you to leave this accursed dream. He talks about wishing someone had done the same for him long ago, before his own body was broken and his own mind was bound so tightly to this strange, looping purgatory. There's real tenderness in how he speaks to you in this moment, a kind of weary affection built up over dozens of hours of quiet companionship in the dream, watching you leave for the hunt each night and waiting, patiently, hopefully, for your return. And when it's finally time, when you finally stop fighting and let him do what needs to be done, there's a sense, even without a single triumphant note of music, that something good has happened. Something kind. Something that, after everything Yharnam has put both of you through, feels earned. I want you to imagine that clinic bed for a moment. The soft light, the quiet click of old machinery somewhere in the background. The absence, finally, of blood and rain and beasts and impossible cosmic horrors lurking just outside your vision. Just stillness. Just rest. Let that image settle over you for a moment, the way it settled over me the first time I saw it. And when you're ready, let's move a little deeper into the fog, because there's one more ending left to explore. The rarest of the three, the one that asks the most of you, and the one that, in its own strange, unsettling way, might just be the most hopeful ending of them all. Chapter 5. Ending 3. Childhood's beginning. The third and final ending is the one most players never see on their first playthrough, and honestly that's exactly how it's designed to work. It's called Childhood's Beginning, and it's often considered the true or secret ending. Not because the game explicitly labels it that way, but because of how much extra effort, attention and understanding it requires to actually unlock. To reach this ending, you need to have collected 3 specific items throughout your journey called the third umbilical cord. These are rare, easy to miss consumable items scattered throughout some of the game's most dangerous and obscure areas and chalice dungeons, tied thematically to the umbilical cords of Great Ones, symbols of a deep primal connection to those cosmic ancient beings. Simply having encountered these items and understood even vaguely what they represent puts you on a very different path than most hunters ever walk. If you've consumed at least one of these third umbilical cords before the final confrontation with Gehrman, something changes. When Gehrman offers you his familiar choice, fight or accept his mercy, a hidden option becomes available if you simply refuse to act at all, letting enough time pass without attacking or being struck down. Instead of the fight beginning, or the quiet mercy of the second ending occurring, the moon presence itself intervenes directly, descending into the scene and killing Gehrman on your behalf, removing him from the equation entirely. This is already a striking departure from the other 2 endings. In this version of events, you don't fight Gehrman, and you don't accept his mercy either. The moon presence, recognizing that you've consumed enough of a Great One's essence to be considered a worthy, viable vessel, simply steps in and takes matters into its own hands, granting you power directly rather than continuing the cycle through Gehrman's usual role. What follows is one of the strangest, most visually striking sequences in the entire game. Your hunter is shown transforming, or perhaps more accurately, being reborn, depending on how you interpret the imagery, and there's genuinely some debate in the community about the precise mechanics of what's happening here. Your hunter either becomes an infant Great One themselves, or gives birth to one, cradled gently in the moon presence's tendrils as the dream dissolves into something entirely new around you. The title card for this ending reads simply, Childhood's Beginning, and the narration, again drawing from the game's own text and from community-compiled dialogue, describes something like a rebirth into a new, higher state of existence. The hunter transcending their old, fragile human self, freed from the hunter's dream entirely, not through death, and not through continuing the cycle, but through evolution, ascension, becoming something wholly new. This ending is genuinely difficult to interpret cleanly, and I think that's very intentional on the part of the game's writers. Unlike the second ending, which offers a clear, if ambiguous, sense of peace, and unlike the first ending, which offers a clear, if melancholy, sense of continuation, this third ending offers something stranger, transformation into the unknown. You're not dying. You're not simply escaping. You're becoming something that the game deliberately declines to fully explain. Something that exists beyond the normal categories of human experience that the rest of the story has been operating within. Some players read this as the most hopeful ending of the 3, the hunter finally achieving the kind of transcendence and communion with the Great Ones that the healing church spent generations desperately, tragically failing to achieve through their blood ministrations and their increasingly desperate experiments. In this reading, your hunter succeeds where an entire city failed, achieving genuine communion with a Great One not through corruption or madness, but through their own strength, resilience, and hard-won understanding of Yharnam's buried mysteries. Other players read it as deeply unsettling, even tragic in its own quiet way. The loss of your hunter's humanity entirely, swapped out for something incomprehensible and alien, a happy ending only in the sense that it ends the cycle of hunting while offering nothing especially comforting or human in its place. Under this reading, your hunter hasn't been saved so much as they've been consumed, absorbed into the same vast cosmic system that consumed the healing church, the Pthumerians, and everyone else in Yharnam's story who reached too far toward communion with something too big to understand. I think, honestly, both readings are valid, and I think that ambiguity is the whole point. Bloodborne, throughout its entire runtime, refuses to give you an easy moral framework for understanding the Great Ones and humanity's relationship with them. They're not villains exactly. They're not benevolent either. They simply exist, vast and largely indifferent, occasionally reaching toward or being reached by human minds that are, in the end, simply too small to fully comprehend what they're touching. The third ending puts you directly into that same uncertain space. You've transcended, you've evolved, you've broken the cycle in the most dramatic way possible, and whether that's a triumph or a quiet tragedy is left entirely up to you to decide, alone, in the dark, long after the credits have finished rolling. There's a lovely piece of environmental storytelling that ties into this ending too if you go looking for it. Throughout the game, you occasionally hear a baby crying, faintly, in certain corners of the map, particularly near locations associated with Murgo, the infant Great One that Murgo's wet nurse is protecting throughout the late stages of the story. Some lore theorists connect this crying and the themes of infancy, motherhood and birth that run throughout the game's Great One mythology directly to this third ending, suggesting that your hunter, upon transcending, essentially becomes a new Great One infant themselves, continuing a strange cosmic cycle of birth and communion that stretches back long before Yharnam ever existed, and that will likely continue long after the game's story concludes. It's a lot to sit with, I know. Cosmic horror rarely offers clean, comfortable answers, and Bloodborne, for all its quiet beauty, is very much a cosmic horror story underneath its Gothic trappings. But I don't want you to stress over understanding every piece of it perfectly tonight. I just want you to picture it gently. A small, strange, glowing form, cradled in impossible tendrils of light, the old dream finally truly dissolving around it, replaced by something new, something unknowable, something that drifts quietly off into a darkness far too vast for any of us to properly imagine. Let your own eyes get heavy along with that image if they aren't already. We've covered all three endings now, but there's still more of the story left to gently unpack together, the people behind those endings and what their choices really meant. Chapter 6: Gehrman the First Hunter. I think it's worth spending a little extra time with Gehrman specifically, because in a lot of ways he's the emotional anchor of every single one of those three endings. Whatever choice you make at the end of the game, it's Gehrman's story that frames it, Gehrman's exhaustion that gives it weight, and Gehrman's own long sad history that makes those final moments land the way they do. Gehrman was, as we touched on earlier, the very first hunter, long before the events of the main game. In the years before you ever arrive in Yharnam, Gehrman worked alongside a young woman named Maria, and together they formed the foundation of what would eventually become the Hunter's Workshop, and the broader hunting tradition that the entire game is built around. Maria, in particular, becomes deeply significant if you play through the Old Hunters DLC, which we'll talk about a little later tonight, but for now, it's enough to know that Gehrman's story stretches back much further and much more personally than most players initially realise. At some point before the game's story begins, tragedy struck Gehrman directly. The details are left intentionally vague in the base game, though the Old Hunters expansion fills in quite a bit more of the picture. Gehrman's body was gravely injured, leaving him unable to walk. Confined to the wheelchair we see him in throughout the entire game. For a hunter, someone whose entire identity and purpose was built around physical skill, precision and combat, this kind of injury represents an almost total loss of self. Everything Gehrman was, everything he had built his life around, was suddenly, brutally taken from him. It was in this state of profound loss and vulnerability that the moon presence found him. We don't get an exact, detailed account of how this first contact occurred, but the implication throughout the game's scattered lore is that the moon presence, sensing an opportunity, offered Gehrman an escape from his broken body, a dream where he could exist without pain, without physical limitation, and where he could continue some version of his hunting legacy by training new hunters to take up the mantle he could no longer carry himself. Gehrman accepted, and so the hunter's dream was born, with Gehrman bound to it as its first and for a very long time only caretaker. Here's the part that I think makes Gehrman's character so quietly devastating once you really sit with it. The deal he made wasn't quite what it seemed. Yes, he escaped his broken body. Yes, he found a strange, dreamlike peace in his role guiding new hunters through their trials. But he also became trapped, bound to the dream by the moon presence's influence, unable to leave, unable to age, unable to die in any normal sense, simply existing over and over, watching hunter after hunter pass through his workshop, train under his guidance, and head out into Yharnam's nightmare. Most of them never returning at all. Can you imagine that kind of loneliness? Watching person after person pass through your care, growing attached to some of them, offering what wisdom and comfort you can, and then simply watching them disappear, one after another, into a nightmare you can no longer personally fight against, trapped instead in this strange, quiet garden, forever. There's a particular detail from the Old Hunter's expansion that adds even more weight to this loneliness once you know it. Before Gehrman ever became bound to the dream, he had a life and people in it, most notably Maria, who trained alongside him and became, by most interpretations, someone he cared for very deeply. The two of them were part of the earliest generation of hunters, working together during the Healing Church's initial, disastrous expeditions toward the source of their blood ministration practices. When Maria, horrified by what she'd witnessed and participated in, eventually took her own life, it left Gehrman not only physically broken, but emotionally gutted, alone in a way that the game only ever gestures toward, rather than states outright. By the time the moon presence found him, offering its strange bargain, Gehrman wasn't just a broken body looking for relief. He was a man who had already lost nearly everyone and everything that had once given his life its shape and meaning. The dream, in that light, wasn't simply an escape from physical pain. It was an escape from a life that had already, quietly, been hollowed out by grief. That context recolours so much of his behaviour throughout the base game. His gentleness with you, his patience, his careful attentiveness every time you return from the hunt. These aren't just professional courtesies extended to yet another hunter passing through his care. They're the actions of someone who has lost people before, who understands intimately how quickly a hunter can be swallowed up by Yharnam's nightmare, and who is trying, in whatever small ways remain available to him, to keep that from happening again, even though he knows deep down that he probably can't stop it. By the time you, the player's hunter, arrive in the dream, Gehrman has clearly been doing this for a very, very long time. His dialogue throughout the game carries a specific, weary texture to it. Not quite hopeless, but heavily, deeply tired, the exhaustion of someone who has said the same warnings and offered the same guidance more times than they can properly count, to more hunters than they can properly remember, and this is really what makes his final offer to you at the end of the game so significant. When Gehrman asks to end your hunt, to grant you release through his own hand, he's not simply performing some kind of ritualistic duty. He is offering you the one thing he desperately wishes someone had offered him all those years ago, before he became trapped in this endless, looping service to the dream. He's trying, in the most direct way available to him, to spare you his own fate. If you refuse him and defeat him in combat, triggering that first bad ending we talked about earlier, there's a real sadness in what that means for Gehrman specifically. His long service ends not in peace, not in the release he was hoping to finally achieve, but in violent defeat, replaced immediately by a new caretaker, you, doomed to continue the exact same cycle he'd been trapped in for so long. In a strange way, this first ending is arguably sadder for Gehrman than it is for you. If you accept his offer instead, triggering the second ending, there's a sense of real, hard-won peace in it, for both of you. Gehrman finally gets to perform the mercy he's clearly been longing to give for a very long time, and in doing so, finally seems to find some measure of rest himself. His impossibly long service to the dream finally, mercifully concluding alongside yours. And in the third ending, where the moon presence itself intervenes and kills Gehrman directly, removing him from the equation entirely, there's yet another kind of tragedy. Gehrman's long service simply discarded, made obsolete, replaced not by a chosen successor, but by cosmic convenience, as the moon presence turns its attention toward your transcendence instead. Across all three endings, Gehrman's story is fundamentally one of an old, tired soul, trapped far longer than anyone deserves to be trapped, longing quietly for an end that only you, the player, ultimately have the power to grant, deny, or bypass entirely. Whatever ending you land on, spend a moment thinking of Gehrman specifically. Think of that wheelchair by the workbench. Think of that tired, familiar voice greeting you gently each time you return to the dream. I think he might just be the most quietly tragic figure in the entire story, hiding in plain sight the whole time, right there at the centre of everything. Rest a little more into your pillow now. We're going to talk about the doll next, and her story is every bit as gentle and every bit as strange. Chapter 7. The doll's true identity. For most of your time in the hunter's dream, the doll functions as exactly what she appears to be. A calm, comforting presence, tending to your needs, allowing you to level up, offering small, gentle words of encouragement before you head back out into Yharnam's nightmare. She feels safe, familiar, a quiet, steady anchor point in an otherwise deeply unsettling world. But like almost everything else in this story, there's much more going on beneath that calm surface than first appears. The doll, we eventually learn through careful attention to item descriptions and certain optional dialogue paths, was originally crafted by Gehrman himself, modelled after someone very specific. A woman connected to the healing church and to the Pthumerian civilization buried deep beneath Yharnam. Her true origins tie back to a figure sometimes referred to as the doll's vile bloods connection, or more directly to a Pthumerian princess, a figure of significant importance to the ancient civilization that once thrived beneath the city, long before Yharnam itself was ever built. If you complete a very specific, easy-to-miss quest line involving a character named the Plain Doll, a more precise formal name, and an item called the Milkweed, or through certain interactions tied to the doll's attire and the choir bell, you can unlock hidden dialogue and hidden interaction that reveals the doll is, in fact, host to a fragment of consciousness belonging to a Pthumerian entity, sometimes theorized to be connected to Yharnam herself, the Pthumerian Queen referenced in the first ending's title. The theory, pieced together carefully by the community over years of close reading and data mining, suggests that the doll's body was crafted by Gehrman as a vessel, and that this vessel was later inhabited, or perhaps always partially inhabited, by the consciousness or essence of an ancient Pthumerian figure, quite possibly a queen, quite possibly connected directly to the bloodline that Yharnam the city is named after. This would mean that the calm, gentle caretaker you've been speaking to throughout your entire playthrough has, this entire time, been something far older and far stranger than a simple mechanical companion. A fragment of ancient royalty, quietly, patiently watching over the hunter's dream, tending to hunter after hunter with the same calm, careful gentleness across who knows how many cycles of the dream. There's a particularly moving detail buried in some of the game's more obscure item descriptions and hidden dialogue that suggests the doll herself is, in some sense, searching for her own kind of release, that her long service, much like Gehrman's, weighs on her more than her calm exterior ever lets on. Certain hidden interactions, accessible only through very specific, easy-to-miss playthrough choices, allow you to comfort the doll in turn, offering her a small measure of the same compassion Gehrman is quietly hoping to receive from you. I find this detail particularly beautiful, honestly. Throughout the entire game, the doll exists in a support role, always giving comfort, always offering calm guidance, never once asking for anything in return. She's there for you every single time you return from the nightmare, patient, steady, unwavering, no matter how many times you've died, no matter how long you've been gone, no matter what horrors you've seen out in Yharnam streets. And underneath that endless patience, the game hints, gently and carefully, that she too carries her own long, quiet weight, her own long, quiet history, her own long, quiet hope for some kind of eventual peace. It reframes the entire hunter's dream once you really sit with it. This isn't simply a way station populated by a broken old man and his helpful assistant. It's a space populated by two deeply tired, deeply patient beings, both of them trapped by circumstances mostly outside of their control, both of them quietly caring for the endless procession of hunters that pass through their care, and both of them, in their own separate ways, hoping that maybe, eventually, one of those hunters will be the one who finally sets things right. There's also a small, quiet detail that ties the doll directly into the ending you receive. In some interpretations, and in some very specific hidden interactions available if you've progressed the doll's questline far enough, her expression, or the small details of her behaviour in the dream shift subtly depending on which of the three endings you're building toward. It's incredibly understated. This isn't a game that spells things out for you in bold, obvious strokes, but it reinforces the idea that the doll isn't just a passive fixture of the dream. She's paying attention. She's invested, in her own quiet, careful way, in what ultimately happens to you. I want you to picture her for a moment, standing near the entrance to the workshop, hands folded gently, waiting patiently for your return, night after night, cycle after cycle for who knows how long. A porcelain face that rarely shows much emotion, and underneath it layers and layers of history, memory and quiet, patient hope, folded up neatly, waiting for someone, for you, to finally acknowledge them. Let your breathing slow down a little more with me now. We've talked about Gehrman, we've talked about the doll. Next, let's gently step back and talk about the moon presence itself and the strange, vast family of beings it belongs to. Chapter 8. The Moon Presence, and the Great Ones. Let's talk, gently, about the being at the very centre of all three endings, the Moon Presence. The Moon Presence is a Great One, one of the vast, ancient, largely incomprehensible cosmic entities that form the true mythological backbone of Bloodborne's story. Throughout the game, you encounter several different Great Ones, or beings closely connected to them, and each one gives you a slightly different lens through which to understand what these entities actually are and what they actually want. If want is even the right word for beings this far removed from normal human motivation. Ebritas, daughter of the cosmos, is one of the more directly encountered Great Ones, found deep within the Healing Church's inner sanctum, physically present and combat-capable, a strange, multi-limbed, tentacled being whose very existence in the mortal world seems to be causing quiet, ongoing harm to those around her. Rom, the vacuous spider, is another, a Great One who has taken on a strange arachnid-like form, maintaining an illusion over the Moonside Lake area, and whose defeat notably causes something significant to shift in the game's Blood Moon mechanics, deepening the connection between Yharnam and the cosmic horrors lurking beyond it. The Moon Presence itself, though, remains largely unseen throughout most of the game, felt more than directly witnessed, its influence quietly shaping events from behind the scenes until that final confrontation in the hunter's dream. The Great Ones, broadly speaking, are framed throughout Bloodborne's lore as beings existing partially outside of normal human perception and comprehension. They're connected thematically to concepts of insight, knowledge, and a kind of terrible, expanding awareness. The game's insight mechanic, in fact, directly ties into this idea, with your character's insight stat increasing as you witness cosmic horrors and consume certain items, gradually opening your perception to things that were always there, but that ordinary, sane human minds are simply not equipped to perceive. This is honestly one of the most elegant pieces of design in the entire game. As your insight increases, the game world itself subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, changes. New enemies appear that weren't visible before. Certain environments shift or reveal previously hidden details. The soundtrack and ambient sound design grow stranger, more unsettling. Mechanically and narratively, the game is showing you exactly what its themes are about. The closer you get to cosmic understanding, the more the ordinary world around you begins to reveal its true unsettling shape. The Great Ones themselves seem to exist in a strange, semi-parental relationship with humanity, at least according to the game's more esoteric lore. Certain descriptions and dialogue suggest that Great Ones experience something like grief over the loss of their offspring, and that this grief drives some of their interactions with humans, who they sometimes appear to view, whether accurately or not, as potential surrogate children or vessels. Murgo, the crying infant Great One we mentioned earlier, whose loss deeply affects the being known as Murgo's wet nurse, is a direct example of this theme. An entire boss encounter built around grief, protection, and the desperate desire to shield something small and vulnerable and precious from a world of hunters trying to reach it. There's another figure worth mentioning here, someone whose story sits quietly at the intersection of the Healing Church and this deeper cosmic mythology. Provost Willem, founder of the choir and of the Healing Church's School of Mensis, a group of scholars who eventually split away from Lawrence's original teachings to pursue a different, more direct path toward communion with the Great Ones, one built around bloodletting rituals and a hunger for cosmic knowledge that far outpaced the original medical goals of the Church. Willem, described in scattered lore as blamed, in both a literal and a symbolic sense, spent his later years obsessed with achieving what he called a descendant of the Great Ones, believing that true understanding required going further than blood ministration alone could ever take a person. His students, led eventually by Mikolash, carried that obsession to its final disastrous conclusion, trapping themselves and countless others inside a shared, nightmarish dream in their desperate reach towards something beyond ordinary human perception. The moon presence, specifically, appears to have taken a particular interest in the hunter's dream and its human caretakers, first Gehrman, and then, depending on your choices, either you or nobody at all, in the case of that third transcendent ending. Its motivations are never explicitly, clearly stated by the game, which is very much intentional. This is, after all, cosmic horror. Full comprehension of these entities' motivations is explicitly framed as beyond the reach of ordinary human minds, yours included, no matter how much insight you accumulate over the course of your playthrough. But we can make some careful, gentle inferences based on its actions across the three endings. In the first ending, the moon presence simply continues its established pattern, replacing Gehrman with you as the new caretaker of the dream, suggesting an ongoing, almost bureaucratic need for a human tether to maintain this strange pocket dimension. Cycle after cycle, hunter after hunter. In the second ending, the moon presence allows Gehrman to finally release you, and by extension, seemingly allows its own grip on the dream to loosen as well, at least temporarily, suggesting either a genuine capacity for compassion, however alien, or simply an indifferent willingness to let the current cycle lapse until a new hunter eventually wanders in to restart it. And in the third ending, the moon presence takes direct, active interest in you specifically, intervening personally to grant you a form of transcendence unavailable to ordinary hunters, suggesting that your particular journey, your particular accumulation of understanding and communion with Great One Essence, marked you as something worth its direct, personal attention. There's a genuine debate among long-time players and lore theorists about how much agency, if any, the moon presence actually has in shaping these outcomes, versus how much is simply a reflection of your own choices as the player. I tend to think that ambiguity is exactly the point. The Great Ones, throughout this entire story, are framed as forces that respond to human action and human understanding, rather than forces that directly, deliberately control human fate. They're less like traditional gods, actively shaping the world according to some grand plan, and more like vast, mostly indifferent natural phenomena, occasionally and unpredictably intersecting with human lives in ways that can look, depending on your perspective, like either miracles or catastrophes. I want you to hold that image gently for a moment as you drift a little further into sleep. Somewhere beyond the edge of what you can properly perceive, vast, ancient, patient things exist, largely indifferent to human concerns, occasionally reaching down or being reached toward by small, curious, desperate human minds, hoping for healing, for knowledge, for transcendence. Sometimes that reaching ends in horror, sometimes it ends in tragedy, and sometimes, if the third ending is any indication, it ends in something that might, just might, be a strange cosmic form of grace. Picture it one more time, slowly, before we move on. Somewhere far beyond the reach of ordinary sight, past the edges of the sky, past the edges of what human eyes were ever built to properly hold, something vast drifts quietly through spaces that don't quite obey the rules of the world, you know. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, patient beyond any human measure of patience, occasionally drawing close enough to brush against a life like Gehrman's, or the doll's, or yours, leaving behind changes that ripple outward for generations. You don't need to understand it fully tonight. Nobody in the entire story ever really does. You just need to let the shape of it drift past you, soft and enormous and strangely gentle, the way a shadow passes over a room when a cloud crosses the moon outside. Let's rest here for just a moment longer, before we move on to the final major piece of the puzzle, the old hunters and the deep, cold waters of the Fishing Hamlet. Chapter 9. The Old Hunters and the Fishing Hamlet. The Old Hunters is Bloodborne's major story expansion, and while it isn't strictly necessary to understand the base game's 3 endings, it adds so much crucial context to Gehrman's history and to the origins of the Healing Church's entire relationship with the Great Ones, that I think it's worth spending a little time on tonight, gently, before we start winding things down. The expansion takes you to the Hunter's Nightmare, a twisted, corrupted version of an old hunting ground located in a region called the Research Hall and, eventually, a place called the Fishing Hamlet, a small, ruined coastal village where the Healing Church first made contact with the Great One's remains, discovering the very blood that would later fuel their entire blood ministration program back in Yharnam. The Fishing Hamlet is one of the most quietly devastating locations in the entire game. It's a small fishing village whose inhabitants, we learn, were transformed and consumed after the Healing Church's early hunters, led by figures including Ludwig, one of the game's most tragic boss encounters, arrived seeking the source of the strange blood rumoured to exist somewhere in the area. What they found was Kos, or possibly one of her more direct kin, another Great One, whose remains had washed ashore in the village, her corpse and its lingering blood serving as the true origin point for the entire blood ministration program that would eventually reshape all of Yharnam. Kos herself is one of the most tragic figures in the entire Bloodborne mythology. Descriptions and hidden lore suggest she was killed, or driven to her death, by early hunters and church members eager to harvest her blood and her secrets, and that this violent, exploitative act, this desperate, grasping human greed for knowledge and power, set into motion the entire chain of events that would eventually consume Yharnam itself. It's framed almost like an original sin, a founding act of violence and exploitation that everything else in the game's story is, in some sense, still paying the price for. The Old Hunters also gives us Maria, Gehrman's former ally and companion, whose story runs parallel to his own throughout the expansion. Maria, we learn, was deeply disturbed by what she witnessed and participated in during the Healing Church's early expeditions, eventually turning her back on the church entirely, and eventually, tragically, taking her own life rather than continuing to participate in the horrors she had helped bring into being. Her presence throughout the expansion, and the quiet, mournful tone of her boss encounter specifically, adds enormous emotional weight to Gehrman's own story back in the base game, reframing his exhaustion and his desire for release as something built not just on his own personal tragedy, but on decades of witnessing the full, devastating cost of humanity's reach toward the Great Ones. The Fishing Hamlet itself is worth picturing slowly one more time before we move on. Small stone cottages, roofs collapsed or half submerged, fishing nets rotted and tangled along a shoreline that never quite feels like it belongs to any ordinary sea. Giant, twisted fishmen wander the ruins, transformed inhabitants of what was once, presumably, an ordinary quiet coastal community, their transformation tied directly to their long proximity to Kos and her lingering blood. Everything about the location feels waterlogged and half forgotten, a place time itself seems reluctant to fully acknowledge, tucked away at the very edge of the game's map, both geographically and thematically, as though the story itself is a little embarrassed by what happened there, and would rather you not look too closely. But looking closely is exactly what the location rewards. It's here, more than almost anywhere else in the game, that Bloodborne's cosmic horror stops feeling abstract and starts feeling personal. This isn't some distant, unknowable threat descending on a city from far away. This is a small fishing village, its people going about their ordinary lives, until a group of desperate, curious hunters arrived seeking a cure, and in their desperation, in their hunger for knowledge and healing, brought ruin down on everyone and everything in that quiet little bay. It's the same story that plays out at a much larger scale back in Yharnam itself, just compressed down into something small and intimate enough to really feel in. Your chest. Ludwig too deserves a gentle mention here. Once the leader of the Healing Church's hunters, before his transformation into one of the game's most tragic and visually striking boss encounters, Ludwig's story throughout the Old Hunters expansion is one of faith corrupted, of good intentions twisted slowly into something monstrous, and of a kind of desperate, lingering nobility that persists even in his transformed beast-like state. His boss fight is widely considered one of the emotional high points of the entire game, a slow, sorrowful battle against someone who was once, very clearly, a good and honourable person, undone by forces far larger than himself. Why does all of this matter for our purposes tonight, when we're really here to talk about the three main endings? Because the Old Hunters expansion, and the Fishing Hamlet specifically, gives us the true origin point of everything that follows. It shows us, in painful, quiet detail, that the entire arc of Bloodborne's story, from Yharnam's blood-soaked streets, to the Healing Church's slow descent into madness, to Gehrman's own personal tragedy, and his long exhausted service to the hunter's dream, all traces back to this one small ruined fishing village, and to the desperate, greedy, ultimately tragic decision to harvest power and knowledge from a being far too vast and far too sacred for any of them to properly understand or respect. Every ending we've talked about tonight, in some sense, is really just the final chapter of a story that began in that small, cold, foggy village by the sea. Gehrman's exhaustion, the doll's quiet, patient service, the moon presence's strange cosmic attention. All of it flows directly out of that original act of violence and exploitation, generations earlier, when a group of desperate, curious hunters reached out towards something ancient and sacred and took from it without ever really understanding what they were taking or what it would eventually cost. I think that's part of why all three endings feel the way they do. Quiet, melancholy, tinged with a kind of inevitability rather than triumph. There was never really a clean, happy resolution available to this story. Not after what happened in that fishing village so many years before you ever arrived in Yharnam. The best any of the three endings can offer is a kind of closure, an end to your own personal chapter of a much longer, much sadder story that started long before you, and that, in the case of that first ending, may very well continue long after you too. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting right now. We're almost through everything, I promise. Just a few more gentle threads to tie together before we close this all the way. Chapter 10. Which ending is canon? This is a question that comes up constantly in Bloodborne discussions, and I want to address it gently tonight, because I think the honest answer is more interesting and more comforting than a simple, definitive pick. FromSoftware, the studio behind Bloodborne, has a long, well-documented history of leaving these kinds of questions deliberately unresolved. Unlike many games, which clearly mark one ending as the true or canonical outcome, often through explicit labelling or through sequel confirmation, Bloodborne has received no direct sequel, and the game's own internal text never explicitly favours one ending over the others as more real or more correct than the rest. That said, if you go looking, you'll find plenty of community debate and a few interesting pieces of circumstantial evidence that different fans use to argue for their preferred interpretation. Some players point to the second ending, honouring wishes, as the most likely default canonical outcome. partly because it's the ending most naturally reached by simply following the game's most obvious, least secretive path, and partly because its themes of mercy and release feel, narratively, like the most fitting emotional conclusion to Gehrman's long arc specifically. Other players argue for the third ending, childhood's beginning, pointing to how deliberately it's hidden and how much extra narrative and mechanical effort is required to unlock it, as evidence that it represents the true, most complete understanding of the game's themes, the natural conclusion for a hunter who has genuinely absorbed and understood the full weight of everything Yharnam's story is trying to say about knowledge, communion, and transcendence. And a smaller, though not insignificant group of players actually argue for the first ending, Yharnam Pthumerian Queen, pointing out that it's thematically the most consistent with Bloodborne's larger cyclical structure, an entire game built around loops, repetition, and cycles that seem to resist any clean, final conclusion. Under this reading, the true ending of Bloodborne isn't really about escape or transcendence at all. It's about the honest, melancholy acknowledgement that some cycles simply continue, that some nightmares don't have a tidy escape hatch, no matter how hard you fight or how much you learn along the way. Personally, and I say this gently, as one small opinion among countless others floating around out there, I don't think there needs to be a single correct answer here. I think Bloodborne is a game specifically deliberately designed to let each player's ending reflect their own choices, their own understanding, and their own emotional relationship with the story they've just experienced. If you fought Gehrman and refused his mercy, maybe that says something true about your hunter's specific personal journey, a refusal to give up the fight, even at great cost. If you accepted his offer, maybe that reflects a hunter who has finally learned, through everything they've witnessed, the value of rest and mercy and letting go. And if you found your way to that rare, secret third ending, maybe that reflects a hunter who pushed further than most, who sought out every hidden corner of Yharnam's mystery, and who was rewarded, or perhaps burdened, with an understanding beyond what most hunters ever achieve. There's something quietly beautiful, I think, in a story that refuses to tell you which choice was the right one. It trusts you, the player, to sit with your own ending, to draw your own conclusions, and to carry your own particular interpretation forward, long after the credits have finished rolling. That's a rare kind of trust for a story to place in its audience, and I think it's part of why Bloodborne's ending, whichever one you happen to land on, tends to stick with people for so long afterward. So if you're the kind of person who needs a definitive answer before you can fully relax and drift off tonight, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I actually think the uncertainty itself is worth settling into rather than resisting. Some stories are built to be resolved. Others are built to be carried with you, unresolved, a little mysterious, a little open-ended, for as long as you're willing to keep thinking about them. Let that idea settle over you now, soft and heavy, like fog rolling in, low over quiet cobblestones. There isn't one right ending. There's just your ending, whichever one you happen to find. We're getting close to the end of our own story now tonight. Just a couple more gentle chapters left before we let you rest completely. Chapter 11, Umbasa, the meaning of the cycle. I want to take a moment, gently, to talk about a word that echoes throughout Bloodborne's story, spoken quietly at key moments. Umbasa. Umbasa is used as a kind of blessing or farewell throughout the game, most notably associated with a hidden covenant called the Cainhurst-adjacent Vileblood tradition, though its actual thematic reach extends much further than that single quest line. Roughly, in the context the game gives us, it seems to function as something like the moon guide thee, or a related blessing tied to lunar and Great One imagery, tying back once again to the moon presence, and the broader themes of guidance, watching, and quiet, distant care that run throughout the entire story. I bring this up here, near the end of our journey together tonight, because I think it captures something important about how Bloodborne wants you to feel about its endings, whichever one you happen to land on. There's a sense, throughout the whole game, of being quietly watched over, guided, even cared for, by forces far larger and far stranger than yourself, even when those forces are frightening, even when their motivations remain frustratingly unclear. The Moon Presence watches over the hunter's dream. Gehrman watches over each new hunter that arrives. The doll watches over you specifically, night after night, cycle after cycle. Even the game's cosmic horror at its core isn't really about isolation or abandonment. It's about connection to something vast, something largely incomprehensible, but something that is, in its own strange way, present and attentive, whether that presence ultimately feels comforting or unsettling. The cyclical nature of the hunter's dream itself reflects this same theme. Hunter after hunter arrives, trains, hunts, and either succeeds or fails, and the dream continues regardless, patiently, endlessly, waiting for whoever comes next. There's something almost meditative about that structure, once you step back and look at the whole shape of it. Individual hunters come and go, their personal stories concluding in one of three ways, but the larger pattern, the dream itself, the hunt itself, the whole strange, sad, beautiful cycle of Yharnam's nightmare continues on, indifferent to any single hunter's personal ending, generation after generation, night after impossibly long night. I think there's something worth carrying with you from that idea, gently, as you drift towards sleep tonight. Your own personal story, whatever shape it takes, whatever ending you eventually land on, is really just one small loop within a much larger, much older cycle. That's true of Bloodborne's hunters, and honestly, in a much gentler, much less cosmic horror-tinged way, it's true of most of us too. We each get our own small chapter, our own small ending, and then the larger pattern simply continues on. Patiently, quietly, long after we've closed our own particular book. That's not a sad thought, not really, or at least it doesn't have to be. There's comfort in being part of something larger than your own single story. There's comfort in knowing that whatever happens in your own small chapter, the larger pattern persists, patient and unbroken, the same way the hunter's dream persists regardless of which of its three doors you happen to walk through. Umbasa, the moon guide thee. A quiet blessing offered gently into the dark for whatever comes next. Let's carry that gentle blessing with us into our final chapter tonight, where we'll wrap up a few last small details before we let you rest completely. Chapter 12. Small details you might have missed. Before we close the book completely tonight, I want to gently walk through a handful of smaller details scattered throughout Bloodborne's story that tie into everything we've talked about so far. You don't need to hold on to any of these specifically. Think of this chapter less like new information to remember and more like a soft, familiar hum in the background as your mind continues drifting towards sleep. There's a detail, easy to miss on a first playthrough, involving the messenger creatures, small, hooded figures that populate the hunter's dream, tending small tasks, occasionally offering cryptic bits of dialogue if you interact with them in specific ways. Some lore theorists connect these messengers to the spirits of previous hunters absorbed somehow into the dream's fabric, continuing to quietly serve even after their own personal hunts have long since ended. It's a small, understated detail, but it reinforces once again just how many hunters have passed through this exact same dream before you, cycle after cycle, most of them fading quietly into the background of the story, unnamed, unremembered, except perhaps by these small, hooded figures still tending the workshop's quiet corners. There's also the detail of the moon presence's design itself, worth sitting with gently for a moment. Unlike many of the game's other great ones and cosmic horrors, which tend toward grotesque, monstrous, almost aggressively unsettling forms, the moon presence, when you finally see it directly at the end of the game, has a strangely serene, almost gentle quality to its design. Pale, smooth, jellyfish-like, drifting calmly rather than lunging aggressively. Some players read this as an intentional visual contrast, suggesting that despite everything, despite the horror and tragedy that surrounds its presence throughout the story, the moon presence itself isn't malicious so much as simply, vastly indifferent, existing on a scale and along a set of motivations that human morality struggles to meaningfully apply to. There's a small, quiet detail in Gehrman's dialogue too, easy to miss if you're not paying close attention during your visits to the dream throughout the game. Certain lines shift subtly the longer you spend exploring, hinting at just how long he's actually been trapped in his role, references to the passage of time that don't quite add up to any normal human lifespan, quiet suggestions that Gehrman himself has lost track of exactly how long he's been serving as caretaker of the dream. It's a small, understated way of reinforcing just how vast and how exhausting his particular tragedy really is, without ever needing to spell it out directly. And there's one more detail I want to leave you with tonight, maybe my favourite small piece of environmental storytelling in the entire game. If you listen very closely during certain sections of the story, particularly near locations associated with Murgo, you can hear faintly, underneath the game's ambient sound design, what sounds like a baby's cry, echoing softly through areas that otherwise seem completely empty. It's easy to miss entirely if you're not specifically listening for it, and even if you do notice it, the game never explicitly explains or confirms exactly what you're hearing. But it ties beautifully into everything we've talked about tonight. Themes of birth, of infancy, of grief, and of the strange, quiet, cosmic family relationships that seem to exist somewhere just beyond the edge of what any single hunter, no matter how much insight they've accumulated, can ever fully perceive or understand. I think that's a fitting note to end on, honestly. A faint, quiet cry, echoing somewhere just beyond what you can clearly hear, reminding you that there's always a little more going on beneath the surface of this story than any single playthrough, or any single explanation video, no matter how long, could ever fully capture. There's a quieter, sadder detail tied to Yosefka's clinic, the very first location you properly explore after waking from the opening cutscene. Yosefka herself, glimpsed only briefly, asks you to retrieve a set of research notes from within the clinic, and if you return to speak with her later in the story, you find her transformed, changed by something connected to the same blood ministration practices sweeping through the rest of the city. It's easy to forget about her entirely once the game's larger cosmic mysteries take over, but her fate is a small, private echo of the exact same tragedy playing out on a much grander scale everywhere else. Someone trying to help, trying to heal, undone quietly by the very tools she was using to do it. There's one more quiet detail worth mentioning before we move on, tucked into the item description of the third umbilical cord itself, the very object required to reach that secret third ending. Its flavor text describes it as something torn from a great one at the moment it lost its child, a fragment of grief made physical, carried by hunters who, whether they realize it or not, are quite literally walking around with a piece of cosmic mourning in their pocket. There's something quietly unsettling about that when you really sit with it. The idea that the very item that grants you transcendence in the true ending is, at its core, a token of loss. Not treasure, not power in the traditional sense. Grief, condensed into something small enough to carry, something small enough to consume. I think that detail alone tells you almost everything you need to know about how Bloodborne wants you to feel about its own cosmic horror. Nothing here is free. Nothing here is simply good fortune or simply victory. Every scrap of power, every fragment of insight, every strange and beautiful transformation carries a cost, usually paid by someone else, long before you ever arrive to benefit from it. Kos paid it in that quiet fishing village. Gehrman paid it in his broken, wheelchair-bound years. The doll paid it in her long, patient service. Even the great ones themselves seem to pay it, grieving children they've lost long before the story ever begins. And you, the hunter, arrive at the very end of all of that cost, all of that accumulated grief, and get to decide, in one small, quiet moment in a dream workshop, what happens next. Not what happened before, that's already fixed, already written, already grieved. Just what happens next, for you, specifically, in this one small corner of a much larger, much older story. Let your eyes close a little more now, if they haven't already. We've walked through the entire dream together tonight. The streets of Yharnam, the quiet workshop, all three of its endings, Gehrman's long tired watch, the doll's gentle patience, the vast, distant, indifferent care of the moon presence itself. There's nothing left to figure out tonight, nothing left to solve, just the soft, familiar hum of a story you already know, settling quietly over you, like fog rolling gently over cobblestones slick with rain that never quite seems to fall. Chapter 13. The Blood Moon and the Nightmare Frontier. I want to spend a little more time tonight on a piece of Bloodborne structure that doesn't get talked about quite as often as the three main endings, but that quietly shapes how those endings actually feel once you reach them. The Blood Moon and the strange escalating nightmare that gradually takes hold of Yharnam as the night stretches on without ever quite becoming morning. Early in the game, Yharnam feels, relatively speaking, grounded. Beasts roam the streets, certainly, and the atmosphere is heavy with dread from the very first moment you step outside the clinic, but the horror is still recognisably tied to something like a plague narrative. A city overrun by monstrous, once-human creatures, hunted by grim, determined hunters trying to restore some kind of order before dawn. It's frightening, but it's a frightening you can hold on to. A frightening with rules you can learn and eventually master. But the longer you play, the more that grounded horror starts to slip sideways into something much stranger. After certain story triggers, defeating specific bosses, accumulating enough insight, progressing far enough into the buried Pthumerian ruins beneath the city, the sky itself begins to change. A vast red moon rises over Yharnam, hanging low and heavy above the rooftops, and with its arrival, the nature of the threat shifts dramatically. Where you were once fighting beasts, you now find yourself facing the celestial emissaries, alien, tentacled creatures utterly unlike anything found in the earlier, more grounded sections of the city. The very architecture of the world seems to bend slightly under the weight of what's now visible in the sky above it. This shift, from beast plague horror to full cosmic horror, mirrors, almost exactly, the emotional arc of the three endings we've spent so much of tonight discussing. The game begins by asking you to solve a problem you can understand, cure the illness, survive the hunt, control the beasts, but by the time that Blood Moon rises, the problem has revealed itself to be something you were never actually equipped to solve in the way you originally expected. There is no simple cure. There is no simple victory. There is only understanding, however painful, however destabilizing, and a choice about what to do with that understanding once you have it. It's worth mentioning gently that the Blood Moon itself seems tied directly to Rom, the vacuous spider, one of the game's earlier, more melancholy boss encounters. Rom is described in the game's own text as maintaining an illusion over the swamp surrounding the Moonside Lake area, an illusion that, once shattered by Rom's death, allows the Blood Moon to finally rise over the entire city. In a very real sense, defeating Rom doesn't simply clear an obstacle. It removes a kind of protective veil, exposing Yharnam and exposing you to a level of cosmic truth that had, until that point, been held carefully, deliberately, just out of view. There's something worth sitting with in that structure. Rom wasn't a monster keeping you out through malice. Rom was maintaining a kind of merciful illusion, however imperfect, however doomed to eventually fail. And your victory over Rom, framed as an unambiguous triumph in the moment-to-moment mechanics of the game, actually represents the removal of the last thin veil standing between Yharnam and the full, unfiltered weight of its cosmic reality. It's a beautifully bitter piece of design when you really think about it. The game rewards you, mechanically, for tearing down the very thing that was protecting you and everyone else in the city from what waits on the other side. This ties directly back into why all three of the endings we discussed earlier feel the way they do. By the time you reach that final confrontation with Gehrman in the Hunter's dream, you're not the same Hunter who first woke up in that clinic bed at the very beginning of the story. You've watched the sky itself change. You've fought things that exist well outside the boundaries of ordinary human experience. You've accumulated enough insight, in the game's own mechanical terms, to see truths that most of Yharnam's population never gets to perceive at all. Truths that, in some cases, are actively driving other characters in the story mad simply from partial second-hand exposure. So when Gehrman finally offers you that choice, fight, or accept, or, if you've gone far enough, transcend entirely. He's not just offering it to some anonymous hunter passing through. He's offering it to someone who has, in their own way, walked the exact same path he once walked, reaching towards something vast and largely incomprehensible, in search of a cure or an answer, or simply a way to make sense of an impossible situation, and finding at the end of that reach something far stranger and far larger than they ever expected. I think that's worth carrying gently into the next chapter, our final one before we close things out completely tonight. A quiet, soft recap of everything we've walked through together, gathered up into one last calm summary, before we let the whole dream finally settle into stillness. Chapter 14. A soft recap, gathered gently together. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, and I don't expect you to have held on to all of it, especially if your eyes started getting heavy somewhere back around Gehrman's long-tired history, or the quiet, unsettling beauty of that third secret ending. So let's gather it all up gently now, one last time, slow and soft, before we finally let the dream close completely. Yharnam is a city built on old stone and older secrets, a place where a desperate search for healing slowly, quietly, curdled into something much stranger. Communion with vast, ancient beings called the Great Ones, beings that exist largely outside the boundaries of normal human comprehension. The healing church seeking to cure the sick discovered the blood of one of these beings deep beneath the city, in a small, ruined fishing village called the Fishing Hamlet, and in doing so set into motion a slow, tragic chain of events that would eventually consume the entire city in blood, beasts and cosmic horror. At the centre of the game's structure sits the hunter's dream, a quiet, pocket-dimension sanctuary maintained by a great one called the Moon Presence, tended by Gehrman, the very first hunter, broken in body and bound to the dream after a great one offered him escape from his shattered physical form. Gehrman, over what seems to be a very long span of time, trains hunter after hunter, sending them out into Yharnam's nightmare, watching most of them fail to return, growing more and more exhausted with every passing cycle. At the very end of the main story, after defeating Murgo's wet nurse, Gehrman offers you release, an ending to the hunt, granted through his own hand, a mercy he wishes someone had once offered him. How you respond to that offer determines which of the 3 endings you receive. If you fight back and defeat Gehrman, you trigger Yharnam Pthumerian Queen, the first ending, in which the Moon Presence simply transfers its bond to you instead, making you the new caretaker of the hunter's dream, continuing the exact same cycle Gehrman had been trapped in, now with you sitting quietly in his chair, waiting for the next hunter who will eventually come to challenge and replace you in turn. If you accept his offer, letting him end your hunter's life peacefully, you trigger Honouring Wishes, the second ending, widely considered the neutral default conclusion, in which your hunter is shown waking back in the clinic bed where the story first began, released ambiguously, either into death or into a genuine return to ordinary waking life, the cycle finally, quietly broken, at least for you. And if you've consumed at least 1/3 umbilical cord and simply wait, doing nothing at all, when Gehrman moves toward you, the Moon Presence itself intervenes, killing Gehrman directly and instead granting you a strange cosmic transcendence, triggering childhood's beginning, the rare secret third ending, in which your hunter is transformed, or perhaps reborn, into something new entirely, ascending beyond the ordinary boundaries of the hunter's dream altogether. Behind all 3 of these endings sits a deeper, quieter web of stories. Gehrman's long, tragic history alongside Maria and the early healing church hunters, revealed more fully in the Old Hunters expansion. The doll's true, ancient nature, quietly hinted at through scattered lore and hidden dialogue, tying her back to the Pthumerian civilization that once thrived beneath Yharnam long before the city above it was ever built. And the Moon Presence's own vast, largely unknowable motivations, watching over the entire cycle with a patience that feels, depending on your reading, either coldly indifferent or quietly, distantly compassionate. None of the 3 endings is officially declared more canonical than the others. Bloodborne, true to FromSoftware's broader design philosophy, trusts you to sit with whichever ending you happen to find and to draw your own conclusions about what it means, both for your specific hunter and for the much larger, much older cycle of dreams and nightmares that your own small story was only ever one brief chapter within. And underneath all of it, quietly, patiently, runs a single, gentle blessing, spoken here and there throughout the story. Umbasa, the moon guide thee, a soft farewell offered into the dark regardless of which door you eventually walked through. That's the whole shape of it, gathered up, gently, one final time. You don't need to remember any of the specific names or specific item locations, just the shape, just the feeling of it. A tired old man in a wheelchair finally, mercifully, set free, one way or another. A patient doll, watching quietly over centuries of hunters she never stopped caring for. And somewhere far beyond either of them, something vast and pale and endlessly patient, watching the whole dream turn over, again and again, waiting quietly for whatever comes next. Let that shape settle over you now completely. There's nothing left to hold on to. Just let it go. gently, the way Gehrman always wished someone would let him go, and rest. So there you have it, 3 endings. One long tired dream. A hunter, an old man in a wheelchair, a doll who was never quite what she seemed, and somewhere far beyond all of them, something vast and pale and patient, watching quietly over all of it. Yharnam Pthumerian Queen, honouring wishes, childhood's beginning, fight and become the next caretaker of an endless cycle. Accept and find a quiet, ambiguous release. Push further than anyone else and transcend into something the story itself declines to fully explain. 3 doors, 3 different kinds of quiet, and no single correct way to walk through any of them. I hope, wherever you are right now, however heavy your eyes have gotten over the last little while, that this slow walk through Yharnam's fog gave your mind somewhere gentle to rest tonight. That's really all any of this is for. Not to test your memory, not to quiz you later on the specific order of chalice dungeons or the precise mechanics of insight thresholds. Just a slow, calm voice, walking you gently through a story you might already know, or might be hearing properly explained for the very first time, letting the weight of it settle over you a little more with every passing chapter, until, hopefully, somewhere along the way, you drifted off entirely. If you're still awake, that's alright too. There's no pressure here, no rush toward any particular outcome. Just close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and picture that hunter's dream one more time. The quiet workshop, the single glowing headstone, the doll standing patiently near the entrance, and Gehrman, tired, gentle, waiting in his chair, ready to greet you softly the way he's greeted countless hunters before you, and will likely go on greeting countless hunters after. The hunt is over now. Whatever ending you would have chosen tonight, it's already happened. Quietly, gently, somewhere in the fog behind you. There's nothing left to fight, nothing left to solve. Just rest now. If you'd like, imagine the credits rolling slowly now, white text drifting up a dark screen, that mournful, string-heavy theme swelling softly somewhere behind it. You don't need to read the names, you don't need to remember anything at all. Just let the music carry you the rest of the way, the same low, aching strings that have followed every hunter through every version of this ending, stretching back further than anyone still awake could possibly count. Picture the rain easing, finally, after so many long unbroken nights. Picture the gas lamps flickering low, one by one, along empty, quiet streets. Picture the workshop, still and silent, its headstone finally dark, its messengers finally resting. Picture whichever ending settled gentlest over you tonight. The quiet continuation, the soft release, or the strange, glowing transformation, and let it be the last thing you carry with you as your own eyes finally close. Somewhere behind you now, the fog is settling lower, thicker, folding gently over every street and rooftop and quiet, empty alley we walk through together tonight. The lamps are dimming, one by one, all along the hill. The bell has stopped tolling, and the hunt, at long last, for tonight at least, is finished. Yharnam is sleeping now too. So can you, Umbasa. The moon guide thee gently into sleep. Good night.